Did you know there's literally a parasite that gets inside the brain of prey, mice as an example, that causes them to lose the fear of the predator that wants to destroy them? Think about that for a second in your own life. What if the one thing that wants to destroy you could feed you a parasite that would cause you to lose the logical fear of being destroyed? That's kind of what I want to talk about in this episode of Leading Leaders. This is about attitude, and you're going to want to stay tuned.
Master the StoryPower Method to captivate your audience, improve workplace culture, and 10x your fundraising.
Scan the QR code to book your first coaching call or visit StoryPowerCoach.com.
Master
Think storytelling's just for bedtime? Nah, it's the secret sauce for business magic. Stuck in a rut with bland pitches and yawning clients? Enter Boost Your Business with StoryPower. 6 weeks of epic storytelling training. It's like leveling up in a video game but for your career. Master the art of narrative and watch connections blossom like a viral TikTok. Simple, impactful, and game-changing. Ready to transform your biz vibes? Dive in now and make storytelling your superpower.
Subscribe now for access to our extensive media library of leadership lessons promoting faith, family, and freedom. Begin your personal growth plan at StoryPowerAcademy.com for leadership development and communication skills training.
I'm Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast. I remember watching the old cartoons before cartoons were woke. When the violence was kind of part of every cartoon that you watched. In fact, I remember watching the Wile E. Coyote using frying pans and anvils and dynamites to try to catch the Roadrunner. Some of the most fascinating things were like when he'd throw the black circle on the top of the bridge, and then the Roadrunner would just run right across the top of it, and then the coyote would get to the black hole, and it was actually a hole, and it would fall through the bridge into the canyon. Some of those things like that, they mess with my head, because I realized that reality and cartoons had like no relationship to each other. But I also remember some of the things, silly little lessons, like the time that the two little dogs were hiding behind the fence. There's the big dog. Where's my gravy? The big dog, the big mean dog. And then the little dog, who was kind of bossy and always chatty, but he also always looked out for this big dog having his back no matter what happened. And in one particular series, Sylvester the cat was on the other side of the fence, and the big dog would come around, and he would scare Sylvester, and he would run off, and the little dog would come around, and Sylvester was only scared because of the big dog, so he would abuse the little dog and then send him back on his way. And this went on for several scenes, and then finally we realized it's not Sylvester beating up on the little dog. There's actually a black panther on the other side, but it was hiding every time the big dog came around. And so at one point he calls Sylvester, or the kitty, to come to his side of the fence. Step into my territory, come into my domain where I got my backup. Because he's on a leash, he can't do much more than that. But come to my, and he would call out, "Here, kitty, kitty, kitty." And then the Black Panther showed up, and it was a mess. All right. I know you're asking, what in the world does that have to do with leading leaders? Well, I'm about to tell you. See, the reason that a little harmless, yappy little dog is willing to go after a bigger dog or a cat is because they're fearless. The real question is, are they fearless logically, or are they fearless because they've got some kind of parasite? Now, I want you to hold that in your mind. This is a biological fact. You can look it up. Humans get the same parasite. Mice get this parasite, and it causes them to not be afraid of cats, and then, of course, they become dinner. But it's a common parasite that gets in the brain of humans. It gets into all kinds of animals that are normally prey and causes them to no longer fear the predator who seeks to destroy them. Now think for a moment in your leadership roles, how often you've encountered someone who they're very mouthy. They got plenty to say. They've got an ego the size of the Empire State Building. They got no substance to back it up. They don't have the history, they don't have the training, they don't have the experience. Maybe they've got the diploma, but there's nothing else behind it. And so leading them becomes very difficult. They don't understand that they could just straight up lose their job. Again, I go back to these police videos. I watch them for the psychology of them, and it absolutely is mind-boggling. Recently, I was watching one where a girl had been ejected from a club because the guy she was with was way over intoxicated, had had way too many drinks, and the club's like, "We're not serving you anymore, get out." And their option was literally just to walk out the door, get in an Uber, and go home and be done with it. That was the end of it. And he walked out the door, dragging his stuff, was making his way down the street, and she turned around and said, "I want to file a complaint." And the police are like, "We are not the complaint department. You're going to have to call the place of business, during regular business hours and talk to the management. That's not our job. Our job is to keep the peace, and right now you are being unruly. We're going to have to file charges on you if you don't leave. All you got to do is leave. Just leave. Get in an Uber, go home. That's it. That's all I'm asking you to do. Don't drive. You're too intoxicated." That was not good enough for her. See, her ego the size of the Empire State Building and the language inside her head had her convinced that she had some rights to declare. She had some authority to demand. She had some ability to exercise her will in defiance of the law, in defiance of a privately owned business, in defiance of all of that. Her attitude, together with her language, inverted in her expectations the prey versus the predator. Now, the officer had cuffs, had the power of the law for disorderly conduct, had the ability to take her to jail. As Ron White often says, "I had the right to remain silent. I did not have the ability." This young woman talked herself into a jail sentence because she couldn't take not being served. If you've been in leadership any period of time, I'm confident, perhaps I'm wrong, but I'm confident that you have run across people who have that kind of an attitude. Part of that attitude gets expressed in words like, "What are you going to do? Fire me? I know my rights." Maybe you've seen the commercial where the young woman comes in and she's doing her job interview. And he says, we work from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. We expect you to show up on time, et cetera, et cetera. She's like, "Oh, 8 doesn't work for me. See, I do my latte and I do this and I do that. And I'll probably get here about 10:30. He's like, "Okay, this is not going to work." She's like, "Well, you can't fire me already. I need my attorney. I know my rights." And he's like, "You don't even have a job. You can't fight to get back a job that you never got in the first place. We're not going to offer you the job because it doesn't work for you. It doesn't work for us. Next." But see, there's something in that, for lack of a better term, that parasite in the brain that says, "I have my rights. I know my rights. I'm going to defend my rights." And so now all of a sudden we're in a battle of words where one person doesn't even have the ground to stand on, and yet they have the ego and the determination to fight for what they want. There's a great video out there. I challenge you to go watch it. Just go to any one of the social media platforms and type in Chase Hughes. And then right behind it, type in "language is a parasite." Language is a parasite. He's got a new book out. It's called Tongue. By his own description, it's weird. It's not a normal book. And if you skim through it, you'll get absolutely nothing. You've got to read the whole thing. But when you do, it's going to mess with your head. And the reason it's going to mess with your head is because he's made some of the same observations that I have. He's eminently more qualified in the world of mind sciences than I am, but some of the same conclusions that he's come to. Here are a couple of them. Now, the first thing that he does in the very beginning of that video is demonstrate to you how, by definition, language is a parasite. I'll leave that to him. I'll let you explore that on your own. He does a great job of it. He sets up the framework of what is the definition of a parasite, and then he shows you how language fits the definition. Have fun with that. But then he makes some very, very powerful quotes, great observations, I think, that as leaders and communicators, we need to be aware of these truths that for most of our lives, since like kindergarten, maybe pre-K, maybe learning to talk. We haven't understood the process of language. He says language doesn't reflect identity, it constructs it. Language doesn't reflect identity, it constructs it. All right, we have grandchildren, apparently another one on the way, and our youngest one is not even a year old yet. But he does make those silly noises that have zero representation whatsoever. Ba, 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 raspberries, constantly. And one of the things that my wife will often do, all of our grandchildren call her Lolly, and sometimes he'll just do that la, 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 and Lolly will hold him and say la, 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 lolly, la, 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 lolly, to try to get him to repeat that back. She's hoping before mom, before dad, before anything else, that the little guy says lolly. Now, whether or not that utterance is going to have a direct reflection to him of who that person is, who knows? I don't know everything that goes on in the mind of a less than a year old. But the idea that language doesn't reflect our identity, it constructs it. We tell people who we are by the words that we use. Right? Think through that for a moment, because we often label an emotion before we feel it. We label an emotion before we feel it. In fact, Chase says in that video, we always label an emotion before we feel it. We put a label on it before we process the actual emotion itself. I want you to hold that notion in your mind for a moment as well, because I'm going to come back to it. He says, how do we get back to the reality before language? How do we get back to the reality before language? And if you watch that video, he's going to put you through an exercise that's going to demonstrate the power of that question. How do we get back to the reality before language? The book tongue is designed to interfere with your language operating system. Now, maybe you've heard in recent months, last couple of years, of this little thing called AI. Another term for AI is a language learning model, also known as an LLM. Literally what it does is it processes data over long periods of time, short periods of time, compiles them, compares them, reacts to this data, and it uses language to do it. And as we've all seen, the little video where the two AIs are talking to each other, and initially they start with English instructions, a typical American conversation, and then suddenly they realize that the ones and zeros data conversation that normally is what happens within a hard drive is easier for them to understand in speaking to each other, and humans can't get it. And so they begin speaking to each other in a digital language that humans cannot decipher. Language learning model. I listened to PBD podcast, yesterday's business podcast. They were talking about the new $640,000 Ferrari and how this Ferrari's design doesn't look like anything Ferrari's ever done. But then somebody showed the picture of another very expensive 400 horsepower car that literally it looks like a smart car. 400 horsepower in a shoe? That's scary. But why did they design that car? Well, because the language of the policies written by government entities demand a specific design, a specific efficiency, a specific adherence to these policies. And in order to achieve that and not be awry of the local legal entities, they had to do what no customer wanted from them. This is a car company that if you'd looked at all their designs, you would never say, oh, that's one of them. In fact, If you put that car next to everything else they've ever designed, you're like, oh, that one's lost. It doesn't, one of these things is not like the other. That one doesn't belong here. But it's theirs, built in their factories, has their brand name. It's not what they wanted, but someone else's language insisted it. It could be a multi-billion-dollar failure. But the people who wrote the language don't care about your profit. The people who wrote the language don't care about your brand. The people who wrote that language don't care about your consumer or your customer satisfaction. That is the farthest thing from their mind. What they care about is control. And they can control you through language that seems innocuous. But when you start changing the language, you change the results, the productivity, the outcome, the brand, the culture. See, one of the things we do here at StoryPower Academy is called the Attitude Hack. The Attitude Hack is specifically designed to help leaders learn how to use failures and successes of the past and move them forward into transformation for the future. How do you futurecast? How do you build plans that are going to be successful? How do you get people on board with that? How do you create buy-in? How do you get participation and engagement to rise in an organization? We're not just talking about compliance because you do it or you lose your job. We're talking about people who have genuinely bought in to the ideas, to the philosophy, to the productivity of your organization. They're consistent with your brand as it represents itself to the world. Not this one misfit that compliance with government entities said, I have to build this thing. Nobody wants it. I'm probably going to lose my shirt and the productivity and profitability of it, but I have to do it because their language says I must. That's not the kind of compliant participation we're talking about. We're talking about engagement that says, I love what we do here. I'm part of this organization. I'm deeply invested in it. They respect who I am. They respect me as a person. Remember, identity isn't reflected in language, it's constructed. Meaning, as Seth Godin says, people like us do work like this. What does that mean? Well, it means we self-identify with others like us. So what's the common ground? Well, if you're the leader, that's your job to define. It's your job to discern. It's your job to communicate. And the challenge for a lot of people is they think, I can do this through procedure manuals. Well, to a large degree you can. But until you have built the language around the identity of your organization, until you have clarity on how the world sees your organization and how you want to be seen, until you've constructed that identity, that brand, and elaborated that internally in culture, you're not going to have what you're looking for. What you're going to have is 1, 2, or 2,000 employees who all kind of have their own way of looking at things. In fact, I would challenge you as a leader in an organization of any size, nonprofit or profit, 2 employees or 2,000 employees, to ask the question, who do you think the world believes we are? What is our brand impression? I'm not talking about our mission statement. I'm saying if you walked out and went to the local restaurant and said, hey, I work for XYZ company, what do you know about us? Are you even known in your local community? Are you known among others who could identify your business profile, what you do, what products you offer, who you serve? When we do the StoryPower courses, the very first week and the very last week, we discuss the same thing, your meta-narrative. From a business standpoint and a relational standpoint, as a leader, your meta-narrative is really simply put, who do you help and how? And if you can't answer that question, then the remainder of Attitude Hack and the remainder of StoryPower is lost in translation. If you don't know who you help and how, not just the big picture of we help people who buy cars. On the Patrick Bet-David podcast, one of the things they pointed out was how many male owners buy Porsche, percentage-wise, and what percentage-wise buy Ferrari. And according to the stats they pulled up in the show, 80% of Porsche owners are male. 80%. Ferrari, 98%. Well, does that matter? Well, it does. When you're branding, when you're talking about your culture, when you're talking about your internal designs of your vehicles, when you're talking about how much space you have in the driver's cockpit or what that driving experience should feel like, all of those things matter because the expectations of a female driver and the expectations of a male driver are significantly different. If your clientele is predominantly male, you should be designing to those people who love the car, males. Now, if you want to shift your business, you might remember a company with a blue can about 2 years ago now, lost several $1 billion because someone in their marketing team said, well, we know who our current customers are. That's not who we want to be our customers. We want to shift to this group of customers. Well, they never really appealed to the new group of customers they were pursuing, but they really did turn off the customers they already had. I don't know what kind of business you're in, but if you disappoint your current customers in pursuit of a customer that couldn't care less about you, that's a no-win situation. And it's an attitude problem. Yeah. The language inside the minds of the department who said, we're going to pursue a customer base that doesn't know about us, doesn't care about us, isn't interested in our product, because we like that customer base better than we like our existing profit. A leader somewhere should have seen that coming. Well, how would you know that it's coming? Well, because it's in their language. It's in the things they're already saying. Language doesn't reflect our identity, it constructs it. The language they're expressing today is language that constructed their identity years ago. La 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 lolly? Yeah, that early. The framework, the mental understanding. Now, sometimes there are cataclysmic shifts that happen when an identity is challenged in a crisis or a trauma. Those kinds of things will change your language. Right? You can fall into a victim mentality, or you can get that parasite that says, I'm fearless. I'll go after anybody. I'll go after anything. You see it sometimes in journalism. And then you see some people in journalism get checked. They're like, I'm fearless. I'll challenge anyone. I'll ask the tough questions. And then they get checked by someone and they realize you could lose your career over this. And if you check the wrong people, you could disappear. Bermuda Triangle style. If that reality hits you, that attitude that says, I'm defiant, I demand my rights, I want what I want, I'm going to go after this, that parasite in your brain, that language that has convinced you that you can take on the world and win every single time. That it doesn't matter what policies and procedures are, it doesn't matter about our internal brand and culture, it doesn't matter what the big uppity-ups, the bigwigs, the investors, the stockholders of this company want. I have my own thing. There was an internal coup of sorts at Disney several years ago where they said, we've intentionally inserted our ideology into the dialogue, the design, and the development of every video that's gone out since we've been here. Well, if you'd gone back to the founders, if you'd gone back to the original company and said, hey, eventually we're going to start talking about all this stuff in the videos, I think Walt himself may have had a heart attack. But you can insert that language a little bit at a time. I know I've given you a big bite to chew today, a lot to think about. Parasites in the mind, language constructing identity, not reflecting it. How do you get reality out of the hands of language?